I never imagined how quickly an ordinary morning could take such a turn. The day began like so many others, a lazy stretch, the faint ache of a restless sleep lingering in my muscles, and the quiet solitude of a house that felt a little too empty. But then there was the smell. It drifted through the open window, teasing me with its rich, earthy warmth, the unmistakable aroma of freshly brewed coffee. I stood in my kitchen, my mismatched pajamas clinging to me as I debated whether to pour myself a cup of the instant stuff I usually settled for, or to take a leap. That's when her voice echoed in my memory, soft and inviting. "Come over for coffee sometime," Charlotte had said weeks ago. At the time, I'd laughed it off, thinking she was just being neighborly. But today, something about that offer felt magnetic, unavoidable. Maybe it was the pull of her voice, or the way her smile had lingered in my mind long after our brief conversations. Before I could overthink it, I found myself standing at her front porch. The morning sunlight bathed everything in a golden glow, catching the delicate curves of the vintage brass doorknob. My heart raced. Why was I nervous? She was just a neighbor. Just Charlotte. Except she wasn't just anything. Charlotte was captivating. She moved through the world like it bent itself to accommodate her. Her laugh was a soft chime, her movements fluid and effortless. Standing there, I felt every ounce of the chaos I carried in my messy bun, my threadbare sweater, and my bare feet. I raised my hand to knock, hesitating as doubts flooded in. Would she even remember inviting me? Would she think I was strange for showing up unannounced? But before I could talk myself out of it, the door opened. She stood there, framed by the soft light of her foyer. She wore a pale gray sweater, its fabric clinging gently to her frame, paired with jeans that fit as if they'd been made for her. Her hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, catching the sunlight like silk. "Oh, hey," she said, her smile widening in recognition. "I didn't expect company, but this is a nice surprise." Her voice washed over me like warm honey, and I felt myself smiling back, even as the flutter in my stomach tightened into something sharper. "I hope I'm not intruding," I stammered, suddenly aware of how undone I looked. "I just smelled coffee and thought of your offer." Charlotte laughed, a sound so light and carefree it seemed to dissolve the tension in the air. "You're not intruding at all. Come in." She stepped aside, and I felt the pull of her presence as I crossed the threshold. Her home was as effortlessly beautiful as she was. Warm wood tones, cozy furniture, and plants that seemed to thrive under her care. It smelled faintly of lavender and citrus, blending perfectly with the coffee's aroma. "Make yourself comfortable," she said, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "Black, or do you take it with cream and sugar?" "Cream, no sugar," I replied, settling into one of the chairs. As she moved around the kitchen, I couldn't help but watch her. There was an elegance in the simplest things she did. The way she poured the coffee, how her fingers brushed against the counter. She caught me staring, her eyes crinkling with amusement. "Long night?" she asked, sliding a steaming mug toward me before sitting across the table. "You could say that," I admitted. "I didn't sleep well." "Dreams or just one of those nights?" she asked, wrapping her hands around her own mug. "Both, maybe," I said, shrugging. "What about you? You seem like someone who has their life together." She smiled softly, tilting her head as if considering my words. "Looks can be deceiving," she said, her voice quieter now. "But I do try to enjoy the little things. Like this." She gestured between us, and the way her eyes lingered on mine made my breath hitch. I took a sip of coffee, savoring the rich, bold flavor. It was perfect, unlike anything I could ever manage to make at home. "This is amazing," I said. "Thank you," she replied, her smile warm. "Coffee is one of my love languages." That made me laugh, and I felt some of my tension melt away. The conversation flowed easily after that, about her travels, her job, the things she loved about the neighborhood. But underneath it all, there was a current I couldn't ignore. It was in the way her gaze lingered a second too long, the way her laughter softened whenever our eyes met. There was a hum in the air between us, like static before a storm. By the time the coffee in my mug was gone, I realized how much lighter I felt. But I also felt something else, something more dangerous. Charlotte wasn't just a kind neighbor with good coffee. She was a force, a presence I couldn't quite define but couldn't look away from. As I sat there, the faint lines of her smile and the warmth of her gaze etched into my mind, I realized one thing for certain. This morning was the start of something. What, I didn't know. But I felt it in every breath, every glance, and every sip of that perfect coffee. It happened so quickly, and yet, the moment seemed to stretch on endlessly. The faintest touch, our knees brushing under the table, sent a jolt through me like a static charge, sharp and electric. I froze, my breath catching as if my body hadn't yet decided whether to lean in or retreat. Charlotte's eyes flicked up to meet mine, and in that fleeting moment, the air between us shifted. It was almost imperceptible, a delicate tug that pulled me closer, even as we both tried to laugh it off. "Sorry," I said quickly, my voice barely above a whisper. "No need to apologize," she replied, her smile easy, but her gaze lingered just long enough to make my pulse race. It was just an accident, I told myself. Just a meaningless, passing touch. And yet, the weight of it settled over us, thick and undeniable. The space between words became heavier, every pause charged with a tension I couldn't explain. Charlotte leaned forward, her hand reaching for the coffee pot. "Another cup?" she asked, her tone light, but there was something deliberate in the way she moved, like she was testing the edge of something fragile. "Yes, please," I said, my voice steady even though my heart was hammering in my chest. As she poured, her fingers brushed mine, just for a moment. It was nothing. It should have been nothing. But the warmth of her touch seeped into my skin, and I felt my cheeks burn. My hand trembled slightly, and I fumbled with my mug, the liquid sloshing over the rim and onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I exclaimed, reaching for a napkin in a clumsy attempt to clean the spill. My face felt like it was on fire, and I couldn't meet her eyes. "Don't worry about it," she said softly, her voice like a balm against my rising embarrassment. She placed a hand on my arm, her touch firm and grounding. "It's just a tablecloth. No harm done." Her hand stayed there, resting lightly against my skin, and I couldn't ignore the way it felt. Steady, comforting, but with an undercurrent of something I didn't dare name. When she finally pulled away, the absence of her touch was almost as palpable as its presence. "You don't have to be nervous around me," she said then, her voice softer, more deliberate. My stomach tightened, a wave of emotions crashing over me, embarrassment, confusion, and something far more dangerous. I looked up at her, searching her face for what? Reassurance? Permission? Her expression was calm, almost unreadable, but her eyes held a spark of something unspoken, something that mirrored the chaos in my chest. "I'm not nervous," I said, though the words felt like a lie the moment they left my lips. Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Sure." The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. I didn't know what to say, how to break the spell that had settled over us. My hands gripped the mug in front of me like it was a lifeline, the heat of the coffee seeping through the ceramic and into my palms. But Charlotte didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it linger, her gaze steady and patient, as if she was waiting for me to find the courage to say something, anything. I started, then stopped, the words catching in my throat. Her head tilted slightly, her expression softening. "You just what?" The question was simple, but the weight behind it was enormous. I could feel the world tilting, the precarious balance between us threatening to give way. I wanted to laugh it off, to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I just sat there, staring at her, feeling the weight of her gaze like a physical thing. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow, as if the walls of the room were closing in. And then she smiled again, softer this time, her eyes warm and inviting. "It's okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything if you're not ready." There was something in her tone, gentle but certain, that unraveled me. She wasn't just being kind, she was offering me something, though I couldn't quite name it. Trust, maybe. Or understanding. I nodded, swallowing hard as I tried to steady myself. "Thank you," I managed, my voice trembling. "For what?" she asked, her tone teasing now, a faint smile playing at her lips. "For this," I said, gesturing vaguely to the space between us. Her smile widened, and for the first time since I'd walked through her door, I felt a sense of ease creeping back in. But beneath it, that hum of tension remained, like a storm brewing on the horizon. And I knew, without a doubt, that this morning was far from ordinary. As the minutes ticked by, the space between us seemed to shrink, even though we hadn't moved an inch. The conversation started light, safe topics like the best coffee blends and her favorite spots in the city. But then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, it deepened. Charlotte began to share stories from her travels. Sunset hikes in Sedona, bustling markets in Marrakesh, and quiet mornings sipping espresso on cobblestone streets in Italy. Her voice was smooth and melodic, her words painting vivid pictures in my mind. I could almost feel the warmth of the sun on my skin as she described the rolling hills of Tuscany, smell the spices she mentioned from a crowded bazaar. Her laughter, soft and easy, had a way of grounding me, settling the nerves I hadn't even realized I was holding on to. But there was also an undercurrent, something about the way her eyes lingered on me, flicking to my lips whenever I spoke or sipped my coffee. It made it almost impossible to focus. My thoughts tangled, and I found myself stumbling over words or losing track of the conversation altogether. Every moment felt charged, and I could feel the tension in my chest building with every glance she cast my way. Then, without warning, a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, followed by the sharp patter of rain against the windows. I turned my head toward the sound, watching as fat raindrops blurred the world outside. Charlotte stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside slightly to peek out. "Looks like you're stuck here for a while," she said, her voice tinged with amusement. I joined her at the window, standing close enough to feel the faint warmth of her presence. Outside, the rain fell in sheets, washing away the morning's golden light and replacing it with a dim, moody gray. "Does this happen often?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything else. "Every now and then," she replied, her voice quieter now, almost reflective. She turned to me, a playful glint in her eye. "But I don't mind. I like the sound of the rain." Her gaze softened as she looked at me, and I felt the moment stretch, heavy and fragile all at once. "Come on," she said, breaking the silence. "Let's make you comfortable." She disappeared into another room and returned with a throw blanket, soft and flecked with earthy tones. "Here," she said, draping it over my shoulders before I could protest. Her fingers brushed my neck lightly, sending a shiver down my spine. "Thanks," I murmured, my voice quieter than I'd intended. She smiled, her lips curling just slightly at the corners. "Let's sit," she said, gesturing toward the couch. The storm outside intensified, the rain hitting the windows harder now, punctuated by the occasional crack of thunder. The soft glow of a nearby lamp lit the living room, casting warm, golden light over the space. I sank into the couch, the blanket still wrapped around me, and Charlotte settled beside me. She was close enough that our shoulders just barely touched, and yet the contact felt seismic. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the rain and the occasional hum of wind. The room felt small, intimate, the storm outside wrapping us in its cocoon. "Do you ever feel like this?" she asked suddenly, her voice low and thoughtful. "Like what?" I turned to her, my heart racing at the weight of her tone. She hesitated, her gaze falling to her hands for a moment before meeting mine again. "Like moments like these are meant to happen. Like they're inevitable." Her words hung in the air, thick with meaning. I felt my pulse quicken, my breath catching as I tried to form a response. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "But this feels different." She tilted her head, her expression unreadable, but her eyes piercing. "Different how?" "Like," I paused, searching for the right words. "Like I've been waiting for it, without even realizing it." Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment, I thought she might say something. Instead, she shifted closer, her shoulder pressing against mine now, the contact sending a ripple of heat through me. "Me too," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible over the rain. The air between us felt impossibly thick, the space charged with something I couldn't name, but didn't dare to ignore. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at her, unsure of what to do, what to say. The storm outside raged on, but inside, it felt like the world had slowed to a standstill. The soft rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, a low vibration that seemed to settle in my chest, amplifying the storm inside me. Charlotte turned to face me, her expression unreadable, yet her eyes seemed to hold a weight I couldn't ignore. "You're fascinating, you know that?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the words weren't meant for the space between us but for me alone. I blinked, caught off guard by the vulnerability in her tone. "Fascinating?" The word felt foreign, too large for someone like me. And yet, the way she said it made it feel true, undeniable. Before I could think, before doubt could steal the moment, the words slipped from my lips. "So are you." Her eyes softened, a flicker of something warm and raw passing between us. I felt her hand move, hesitant at first, until her fingers brushed against mine. The contact was gentle, deliberate, and yet it felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. Her hand found mine, her palm warm against my skin. She didn't grip it, didn't pull me closer. She simply let her touch linger, as if waiting for me to decide. The moment stretched endlessly, the sound of the rain outside muffled by the rush of blood in my ears. My heart raced, every beat echoing the chaos I felt inside. I should have pulled away. I should have said something light, something to dissolve the weight of the silence. But I couldn't. Instead, I looked down at our hands, her fingers resting softly against mine, and then back up at her face. Her eyes searched mine, her expression a mix of vulnerability and quiet determination. "I don't think I've ever," I began, my voice faltering. "Me neither," she said quickly, her voice steady but soft. "But here we are." The way she said it, calm and certain, made my breath catch. It felt like permission, like a reassurance that whatever this was, whatever we were, it was okay. Outside, the storm grew louder, lightning flashing briefly through the window, illuminating her face. The sound of rain pounding against the glass filled the space, but it felt distant, a background hum to the moment we were sharing. My chest tightened, the weight of the unspoken words between us almost unbearable. "Charlotte, You don't have to say anything," she interrupted gently, her thumb brushing against the back of my hand. I wanted you to know how I see you." The honesty in her words shattered whatever walls I had left. I felt exposed, raw, and yet I wasn't scared. Not of her, at least. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my voice barely audible over the storm. Her lips curved into a small, understanding smile. "Neither do I. But maybe we don't have to know. Maybe we just let it happen." Her words hung in the air, heavy and electric, like the storm pressing against the windows. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. Instead, I turned my hand, letting my fingers intertwine with hers, answering her not with words, but with the simple act of not letting go. She shifted slightly closer, her knee brushing mine again, but this time, there was no awkward laughter, no hurried apology. There was only the warmth of her presence, the steady rhythm of her breath mingling with mine. The rain continued to fall, its relentless patter echoing the rhythm of my racing heart. The world outside blurred into a haze of grays and silvers, but inside, everything felt sharper, more vivid. As I looked into her eyes, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to before, that this wasn't just a fleeting moment. This was a beginning. The next few minutes unfolded like a dream, surreal and impossible to grasp, yet utterly vivid. Her words echoed in my mind, each syllable hitting like a thunderclap. "I think I've wanted this since the day I met you." Her voice had been calm, steady, but the vulnerability in her tone was unmistakable. It stripped away every excuse I'd been clinging to, every reason I'd told myself to hold back. The walls I'd carefully built crumbled in an instant. I couldn't think. I couldn't speak. All I could do was close the distance between us. When our lips met, it felt as though the storm outside had seeped into the room, swirling around us with electric intensity. Her lips were soft but insistent, moving against mine with a kind of urgency that made my pulse race. The kiss wasn't just a kiss, it was a release, a dam breaking, a tide rushing in. My hands found their way to her shoulders, then slid down her arms, trembling as they moved. I felt her respond, her fingers tangling in my hair as she deepened the kiss. The taste of her lingered on my lips, warm and intoxicating, and I couldn't get enough. The world outside disappeared entirely. The rain, the thunder, even the dim glow of the lamp. It all faded into the background, leaving only her. She pulled back slightly, her breath warm against my skin, and looked at me with a mixture of longing and hesitation. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Yes," I breathed, the word escaping before I could second-guess myself. Her lips curved into the faintest smile before she kissed me again, slower this time, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She guided me gently, her hands finding the hem of my shirt and lifting it over my head. I let her, my breath hitching as her fingers grazed my skin. There was no hesitation in her touch, only a quiet confidence that made my nerves melt away. Every brush of her fingertips sent a ripple of warmth through me, igniting parts of me I hadn't allowed myself to feel in so long. Time seemed to stretch and blur. I was acutely aware of everything. The way her hands moved with precision and care, the sound of her breath mingling with mine, the steady drumbeat of the rain outside. When she touched me, truly touched me, I couldn't hold back the shudder that coursed through me. My body felt like it was on fire, every nerve alive and buzzing with sensation. It was overwhelming and terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "Breathe," she murmured, her voice soft and grounding. I did, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The tension in my body eased, replaced by something lighter, freer. Her touch wasn't rushed. It was deliberate, almost reverent, as if she was learning every part of me with care. The moments that followed felt both endless and fleeting. Each sensation, each shared breath, bound us together in a way that words couldn't touch. It was as if the storm outside had found its mirror in us, a wild, chaotic energy that somehow brought a sense of calm. When it was over, I lay there, breathless and weightless, the echoes of her touch still lingering on my skin. She was close, her presence steady and grounding, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel alone. Reality began to creep back in slowly, the soft patter of rain filling the room once more. My thoughts were a jumble, my heart still racing as I tried to process what had just happened. But as I glanced at her, saw the softness in her expression and the quiet intensity in her eyes, I knew one thing for certain. Nothing about this morning, about us, would ever be the same. When the intensity between us finally ebbed, leaving only the quiet hum of our breaths and the rain outside, we stayed there, suspended in a moment that felt both timeless and fragile. Charlotte's eyes found mine, and for a long while neither of us spoke. There was no need for words, not yet. Her expression was unreadable, but her gaze was steady, almost searching. I wondered what she saw when she looked at me like that. Did she see the same mix of emotions that was clawing its way through me? The exhilaration, the fear, the nagging questions that were starting to creep in now that the fire between us had cooled? And yet, in that instant, I couldn't bring myself to regret a single thing. But then my phone vibrated, its sharp, jarring buzz cutting through the stillness like a slap. The sound dragged me out of the cocoon we'd created, pulling me back into the world I had momentarily forgotten. I blinked, the spell broken, and stepped back, instinctively putting distance between us. Charlotte didn't move. She just stood there, watching me with an expression that was difficult to place, somewhere between understanding and longing. "I should go," I whispered, my voice trembling as I glanced at the phone on the coffee table, its screen lighting up with another notification I couldn't ignore. She didn't try to stop me. She didn't plead or ask me to stay, and somehow, that made it even harder to leave. Instead, she nodded, her lips curving into a small, bittersweet smile. "Whenever you want to come back," she said softly, her voice calm but laced with something I couldn't quite name. "You know where to find me." Her words settled in the air, lingering like a promise, or perhaps a challenge. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and turned toward the door. My movements felt mechanical as I grabbed my jacket, slipping it on even though it was damp from the earlier rain. My fingers trembled as I reached for the doorknob, the cool metal grounding me just enough to take the first step out into the storm. The rain was relentless, soaking me almost immediately as I stepped onto her porch. The chill bit at my skin, but it was nothing compared to the heat still radiating from inside me, a residual echo of everything that had just transpired. The walk back to my house was a blur. My feet carried me automatically, splashing through puddles as the rain came down in torrents. The world felt muted, the only sounds the steady drumming of water against the pavement and the faint roll of thunder in the distance. But inside my head, it was anything but quiet. Her words echoed over and over, intertwining with the lingering sensation of her touch, her kiss, her voice whispering my name. Every step I took felt like it was pulling me further away from her, yet somehow tethering me to her even more tightly. And then there was the guilt. It crept in slowly, winding its way around the joy that still thrummed in my chest. What had I done? What did this mean? The questions swirled, relentless and unanswerable, as I pushed through the front door of my house. Once inside, I stood there for a moment, dripping rainwater onto the floor, staring at the space that had once felt so familiar but now seemed impossibly foreign. Everything was the same, yet nothing was. I found myself moving to the window, drawn by the sight of Charlotte's house across the street. The lights were still on, a warm glow in the darkness. I could almost picture her standing there, her hair slightly tousled, her expression calm but knowing. Her scent lingered on my skin, faint but undeniable, and I wrapped my arms around myself as if to hold on to it for just a little longer. My mind raced with memories of her touch, her voice, the way she'd looked at me like I was something she'd been searching for. But then the questions came rushing back. What did this mean for us? For me? Was this just a fleeting moment, or the start of something I couldn't yet fathom? I leaned my forehead against the cool glass, my breath fogging up the pain as I watched the rain continue to fall. The storm mirrored the chaos inside me, wild and untamed, refusing to settle. Nothing would ever be the same again. I knew that much. And yet, as I stood there, staring out at the dim light of her house across the street, I realized that part of me didn't want things to go back to the way they were.